Good morning, everyone. I'm Amherst Williams. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut League of History Organizations, and I want to welcome you to our third session of Archives 101. This webinar series is presented by the Connecticut League of History Organizations and Conservation Connection with a grant from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission of the National Archives. And we are very grateful to the NHPRC for their support in making this happen. Today, we are talking about creating finding aids, and we have with us today Brian Stevens, who's archivist and special collections librarian at Western Connecticut State University. In addition to having extensive experience both at NYU and at WestCon in managing archival collections, working on important software related to archival work, including Archivist Toolkit, which is now Archivespace. Brian is also the founder and administrator of Connecticut Archives Online, also known as CAO, which is based out of WestCon and basically serves as a statewide aggregator for finding aids for collections across Connecticut. I think in the interest of, I'm sure you are all, after last week's session, we started talking a little bit more about finding aids. So I'm sure you're all eager to dive in. I guess I'll just say, if you have any questions as we go, as usual, you can pop those in the chat. As always, we're recording this and the recording will be available on our YouTube channel and on the Google Classroom afterwards. And we'll definitely have time after Brian's presentation as well for a more extensive Q&A. But if you have anything as you go, please pop it in the chat and Emily and I will queue it up for Brian. Brian, are you ready to go?
I think so. I'm unmuted. So
step one.
Step
Check.
one. All right. So
take it away.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So if any of you had a chance to look at what was the homework for this presentation, you'll probably realize that what is going to be covered probably for you to become an expert in what is in a find aid will probably take longer than what we are doing here. My goal is to give you as much as sort of a theoretical overview of what that finding aid is doing, and then talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of actually creating one. We'll look at Connecticut Collections interface for entering data for a finding aid, and we'll also look at Archivespace. So off we go. I'm going to just share my screen here. And does it look like I have a slideshow up there? I think it does.
Looks good, Brian.
All right. So what does it mean? Like, having a finding aid, one of the most important parts to remember is a finding aid is, yes, for the researcher, but it's as important to the archive as it is to the researcher. So, you need to provide access to materials for yourself, because if somebody asks you a question, you need to be able to find things in your own archive. And in order to preserve things, you need to know what you have. So a finding aid is a way of knowing what you have, and so you can help people, and knowing also what you don't have. Frequently, you will get asked as an archivist, do you have this, particular thing, because the person came from the town that you're the your historical society represents, but if you don't have it, you don't want to waste their time in making them come in and look for something. And, so you want to save people that trouble. And one of the things I'm going to try to hammer home today is you want to work in a standardized environment. And the reason for that, well, there's a couple reasons for it. One, if I win the lottery and I leave tomorrow, the person who comes and takes my position shouldn't need to learn the Brian Stevens way of archiving. They should learn a standardized way of being an archivist and how things are described and organized and how boxes are set up and things like that. So having this standardization is really important. And so if a new archivist comes in and they see a finding aid, an archivist understands what a finding aid is. And so everybody is, working in the same language, if you will. So it helps you, but it also, if a researcher Googles something and they see something from a finding aid, they're going to know what you have, know what you don't have, and hopefully, and they'll know what to ask for when they come in. I'm looking at, the Danbury Industrial Corporation records, and the stuff I want to look at looks like it's in box 5. So that saves you a lot of trouble. When they come in, you pull box 5, you're ready for them. So, finding aids. So last week, Leith and Linda talked about arrangement, and really the finding aid is the manifestation of, or that representation of how you've arranged something. So it tries to describe what you've done to the material. So in general, that finding aid should tell people what repository holds the material, give a title to the collection, give the researcher and yourself an idea of the date range of materials, that being what's the earliest date it relates to and what's the latest date it relates to, how much stuff is in it. If you have a researcher coming to you who wants to visit Connecticut from Alaska, and they want to look at the, Silas Stingy papers, and the Silas Stingy papers is really just a folder, you might want to save them the trip. So knowing how much stuff is relevant to a researcher, and also you, because then you know how much space it's taking up. Any restrictions on the material. So you want to tell people if they can't look at, I work at a university archives, there are personnel personal information in some of the collections that can't be open to researchers. We're going to keep it, but we're not open. Those materials aren't open to researchers. So if you have any things that have restrictions on it, you want to have that in the finding aid. And then who is responsible for this finding aid? Just like anything, the person who processes that finding aid it's actually important. It is a bit of the provenance story of the collection, because you as the processor are imposing your view on that person's or that organization's materials. So all that stuff is pretty fundamental to what's in a finding aid. And then specifically, you start doing things like as if you were cataloging a book. Who created the collection, what subjects relate to that collection, and what to expect when you start to look at the collection. Is this going to be a bunch of clippings from the newspaper? Is this going to be a bunch of photographs? Is it going to be whatever? Telling the researcher what to expect, what is the scope of the material, and then finally the inventory of the contents. Here's this picture of, as best you can, to sort of relate to the researcher what you have. So the controlling that collection, what my slide says is controlling your collection is controlling the description of it. So I know what boxes are, I know what's in what boxes. I know what this collection is. I know where it came from, all this kind of stuff. I have control over it. And that's what the finding aid fundamentally is trying to do. And over here is a picture of an old finding aid from before I started working here. So that's the sort of philosophical overview of things. You've heard the word DACS bounced around, and I just want to make sure it's clear what DACS is. So, as this is not really an I mean, I'm fine if people chime in, but DACS, if it's not clear to you, is giving one guidelines of what to put into particular fields when you're describing a finding aid. So if you're saying, if you're giving a title to a collection, it gives you guidelines of like, this is when you should say, this is the, you know, I'm just picking a name out of the list of participants. This is the Elaine Turner papers. And that is a fine title for an archival collection. You wouldn't probably want to call it the Elaine Turner records, because records implies that it is a corporate, unless they were corporate records. But, you know, so there are certain guidelines about what you should name things. None of it's really that complicated, but it is giving you, so when you refer to a creator, you refer to it in a certain standard form. You usually a Library of Congress, last name, comma, first name, that kind of thing. So all that stuff is what DACS is guiding you with. So the content of the descriptive elements. Then there's this thing, EAD, and probably most of you have heard of EAD. But EAD is a structure and a list of elements that finding aids can have. DACS is telling you what should be there and what should be in those fields, but EAD is the structure of those fields. If that doesn't make sense to somebody, put it in the chat. But EAD is a way of storing your finding aid data in a way that is shareable across the world. So it's like, and you know, in my slide here, I'm saying it's like a currency. If you know, if you want to facilitate buying a cup of coffee, use the currency that most people accept. EAD, if you're going for a grant, if you want to participate in Connecticut's Archives Online, if you want to participate, there's a national project out there called NAFN. If you want to participate in these things, having EAD is the way to go. So what is EAD? EAD is like, it looks like HTML code, if you've ever seen what HTML code, but it's called XML. And I'm not going to go where that is beyond our goal here to talk about XML, but it's something you should probably be aware of. And so here's this picture of an old word processed finding aid. Perfectly fine in terms of what it includes, but it's word processed. Nothing knows that, oops, sorry, it just moved my slide. Nothing tells a computer that this here, hopefully my cursor is showing up, is the title of the collection. Your brain just says that's the title of the collection, but EAD actually is in the background and says that this is the title of the collection, and I've input it here, and it's input it in this font, and this is the dates of these are the dates of the collection. So it's a way of, it's called indexing, but it indexes everything in your description so that it can be used as data. So once you have that, you can style finding aids to be any number of ways. And like, here is an example of one of a very simple finding aid that we have here. But that's because I know EAD. I have been working with EAD for 20 years. It doesn't scare me, but it scares a lot of people, and I understand why. But here's the thing. Nowadays, you don't really have to worry about it. If you use a tool like Connecticut Collections, something like Archive Space, out of Canada, there's this ATOM project or A2M. All these tools that are used by archives will generate EAD export. If any of you are librarians, EAD is equivalent to MARC. Now, most librarians don't have to deal with MARC, catalogers do, but it is the form that bibliographic records are in. No matter what system you're using MARC. If you're not, then you don't have a catalog. So EAD is that important, but you don't have to know the ins and outs of XML and EAD for that matter to take advantage of it. You can take advantage of it through using software. But that being said, even if you do like punt on EAD or some of these technical things, it's still advisable that you use DACS and that you use the fields that are in EAD to describe your collection. Because at some point, somebody's going to be like, that should be in a standard form. It shouldn't be word processed. And it will be a lot easier for that person if your fields coincide with EAD. And the way you're filling out those fields is based on DACS. So even if you're not on board or, with EAD, you still sort of have to nod to it. But it's not, I mean, everything that that Leith and Linda were talking about, all that stuff, is incorporated in EAD, and that's how it was designed to accommodate arrangements and capturing information about archival collections. It's not, and it's not intuitive if you love double negatives like I do. All right. So a finding aid is structured not unlike a menu. And like a menu, if you walk into a restaurant and you don't have a menu, how are you going to know what they serve other than, like it smells like pierogies, and you want to know what that restaurant usually has before you even go in. So most times, as I'm sure I'm not alone, I look at a menu online before I go into a restaurant. I even want to see what people say about that restaurant, but the analogy holds. And so a menu will tell you, especially printed menus, will tell you, the restaurant level information, where this restaurant is, what it serves, its hours, that kind of thing. All right. And like the finding aid, we mentioned before, that analogy should kind of square with you. If it doesn't, let me know. And then inside of a menu, like in this example from one of our collections, it kind of has collections. It has collections of potatoes, sandwiches, supper specials, and it tells you a little bit about what those supper specials are and their price. But that's kind of what you want to do with your finding aid. You want to, or imagine, if somebody comes to your archive, you want to be able to tell them that you have these different kinds of things. So that the finding aid should sort of work this way. So to beat this analogy, I don't like saying beat a dead horse. It seems not nice, but let's kick a dodgeball. A finding aid, here is a finding aid for a menu collection that we have, and just want to sort of go over a little bit. So graphically, this is how we're styling the finding aid, but there's a couple things to point out. So you'll see that we have series here, East Coast, Hawaii, Midwest. We have a bunch of notes here. So this is your top level information. It talks about the title of the collection. I don't know why it's not showing dates, but maybe we don't have them in it. Should. And that's also a good thing, a good point to make here. When you're creating a finding aid, it is not in stone. It should be an active document. It should be a document that you update regularly. It's not uncommon to revisit finding aids. I've totally redone a couple collections finding aids. You find typos, you find, mislabeled things. It's not an oversized fold, it's not an oversized box 1, it's in the oversized box 2 or something like that. Things like that happen when you're doing data entry, and so you want to be able to change that sort of thing. In the old days, it used to be, and I brought out one of our old binders, like I don't know if you can see my little picture, if my picture in the corner there, but used to have a printed binder full of your finding aids, and it was a pain to have to go print things again. That is not the paradigm anymore. So you should feel free to regularly update, and I will update this one. And then you see basically in our view here, the essential things that you would need to know. Menus from the United States, things like that. So a couple things about the notes that are important in a finding aid. So this is the Robert Craigie menu collection. Anybody know who Robert Craigie was? I doubt it. But it's important just in terms of where this came from, that it tells you something about the collection. So you tried to inform people that he wasn't a food critic. He wasn't he wasn't a graphic designer. He was a guy that was going around stealing menus, essentially. And because of the statute of limitations, he cannot be prosecuted, and he's also no longer with us. So, so we're safe. But you want to say something about this person. You don't have to write a book about them. If it's a famous person, you don't have to write, a new biography of them. You just need to sort of identify who's this collection represents, or who was this creator of this collection, and really how it relates to the materials in the collection. So if you had like Mark Twain materials, you don't have to write a biography of Mark Twain. You can just say the famous writer Mark Twain, corresponded with this resident of Ansonia for a few months in 1886, and here's and these are the letters they wrote about farming and blah blah blah. But that would suffice. You're just identifying Mark Twain in terms of how he relates to this material. And then you have things like, we talked about whether somebody can use the collection, whether somebody can access it. And I just want to make a note about the difference between access and use. Use actually means that somebody is going to use something from the collection. So I want to scan this menu, or I want to take your scan of this menu and make a t-shirt. It's going to be a commercial use. So you, as the archive, can decide whether that, is fine with you, or you want to get a piece of that, or whatever you want to do. But use is different from access. Access is just, we're going to let you look at anything you want in this. We're not going to stop you. You can look at everything here, but use is actually a different thing. We're going to let you use this material in some way outside of the realm of this archive. Generally speaking, we use a non-commercial share alike license for most of our materials. And if there's copyright on, like in this collection, if there's copyright on a menu, that is up to the person who's going to use it, not us. We are presenting it, is fair use, because the handling the material is going to be detrimental to it. So scanning it was what we did. So if somebody wants to put it on a t-shirt, that copyright issue has to be sorted out by the person using that for commercial use. So now we're into the inventory. The inventory is really the most important part and the most complicated part of your finding aid. But that being said, it's not absolutely necessary. So you can have a collection level finding aid that says, I have 7 boxes of menus ranging from, Maine to Southern California or Hawaii. It was and talk about just the biography of that person, but never actually inventory the materials. You can do that. It's not obviously going to help you if somebody comes in. I want to see the Ala Mona Honolulu menu. Do you have that menu? If you're not listing it at all, you wouldn't know whether you had it unless you have just a great memory. So not having that inventory does have its downsides, but it also in pragmatically describing something, if you don't have anything online about that you have menus, it's probably better to have a collection level finding aid out there in the meantime while you're creating an inventory. So yes, it's the most important thing, but it also is something that you can do without for a while. It's probably not something, especially in a collection that's going to be used quite a bit or that's important. In my homework, I talked about research intensity or value or research value of something. If something is really of high research value, then the granularity of your description is going to be warranted. If it's less important, here's a bunch of receipts from a box making factory. No, you probably don't need to go into very granular detail on it, because at least when I was in library school, the term was intensity of the record. It's not a very intense record. An intense record would be a letter from say a woman who was a nurse in a hospital in the Civil War, writing about procedures and organization and techniques and all that sort of thing. That would be a very intense record, because you have a primary source, you have an important historic period, an important historic event, you have a eyewitness to a underreported aspect to this important event. So that is a highly intense record. So you would want to devote a lot more time to inventorying material like that, as opposed to something that was like business receipts. The other thing that the inventory tells you is it tells you where to find that material. So if somebody wants to look at the Ala Mona Honolulu Hawaii menu, it's in box OS1, folder 2, item 3. And this example happens to be an item level finding aid, which is a fairly rare occurrence. It just so happens that there would be other ways to do this, but we were scanning this material for an exhibit, so it ended up just doing an item level inventory was fine. And did it warrant it? Maybe, but maybe not. But it's there. If you can do that. But more typically, when you're inventorying things, you're inventorying them at the file level. And let me look at the time here. I'm gonna fly through file level. Despite how my slide is set up, if you go to a doctor's office and you ask for your, or the person at the desk asks for your file, they're not asking for a folder, they're asking for the group of material, and increasingly it's digital, but if it's not digital, they are just getting a group of stuff that's your file. And that's the spirit of file level description. It's not folder. Folder is the container. File is the intellectual structure of, so in this example, general air problems, 1957 to 1990. In this collection, the file on general air problems is this. So when you're doing file level description, it allows you to, one, take a more, take a broader sweep of what is in something, what should be included in something, and then it cuts down on you having to inventory, there may be 70 things in that folder. If you inventory, you'll be there. This collection happens to be, I think, 48 boxes. If you did an item level inventory, it would be really hard to go through and not that useful. And so this is a typical example where you've processed something, and in this case, this was a faculty member at WestCon. They actually filed this material as general air problems 1957 to 1990. He did file, he made a morgue file of subjects relating to Danbury. And so what the processors did is they just refoldered that stuff into acid-free folders and inventoried it on a spreadsheet. And now today, here it is. But it tells the researcher generally where something is. It doesn't tell them, if you're looking for, carbon monoxide, poisoning near Danbury Airport, it's not going to tell you that here. But if you were researching those sort of things, you might pull this folder, and that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to not, solve every problem the researcher may have, but you want to just guide them to things that may be relevant. And that's what file level description is. So in the example of the doctor's office, if they want to look at things that relate to, Brian Stevens, they're going to pull even if they don't know what my health problems are, they're just interested in me, they're going to pull that file and look at the stuff inside. And it's not a undue burden to do that. It works, because to list everything out individually is going to be too time consuming. The other thing I want to say about this is, so you see here, Danbury Airport, 1957 to 1996. And it has a note about what's inside. And it's folders 22 through 26, okay? How do I know air travel? Is this tickets? What is this stuff? And the thing is, in the beginning of this finding aid, it tells you that most of this collection is news clippings. So, and from the News Times. You don't have to have that in every, in every item in the inventory. You don't have to reintroduce that concept at that level. the way the finding aid works is it inherits information. So this air travel series is collocating together these things that have to do with air travel in Danbury, not air travel in general. So it's slightly different than what we're used to if you're in a library or in other realms. This hierarchical description is key to what a finding aid is trying to do. You say, in this case, this collection is the Truman Warner papers, and the constituent parts are all Truman Warner papers. We don't have to say that in the inventory. So this hierarchical description is, fundamental to how a finding aid works. So I'm going to pass through this kind of quickly. So how do you create a finding aid? So we talked about using software to do it, and that's probably the best thing that you can do. And there's, Archive Space, Connecticut Collections has their EAD or their finding aid creation module. There's other software out there, but really what you want to look for is something that exports EAD. And that's, really the key. After that, creating word process finding aids. Like I said, you want to adhere to standards and content standards when you do that. But if you make an inventory, do not make an inventory in a word processor. Use a spreadsheet. If you need to paste that spreadsheet into the Word document or the word process document to print your PDF, fine, but do not. A table in a word processor is a terrible vessel for data, and that's what an inventory is. So, and I have a slide that shows you an example of like a spreadsheet inventory. And then after that, the last thing would be just, the worst thing that you can do is just do a word process finding aid. It's not. I'd say the worst thing is, in order of efficiency, that's the least efficient use of your time. Okay, so we saw a representation of that menu finding aid. This is how it looks in Archive Space. There's all the series at the top. We're at the collection level here. It's set up in this hierarchical realm where that's the key to all this. This is why these interfaces look this way, is because that is the fundamental of this spirit of the finding aid, is this hierarchical description. So that's what the interface looks like in Archive Space. This is what the interface looks like in Connecticut Collections. The fields like collection identifier, I'll just touch on that for a little bit. A collection identifier is akin to a call number in a library, or it is something that you can formulate on your own, but it's an important thing to have. So it's just shorthand for the title of the collection. So if somebody says to me at WestCon, I need MS-026, I know immediately what that is. Not every collection I know that, but the ones that get used a lot, I know MS-026. That also dictates how I name digital objects that come from that collection. So those identifiers are an important part. So sometimes people use accession numbers for collection descriptions. That's problematic from the standpoint that sometimes collections have multiple accessions associated with them. So breaking that bond, you can, in your finding aid, you can say that it includes these accessions, but your identifier should not probably be an accession number unless your house uses a one-to-one relationship between those two, and they probably shouldn't. But repository name, repository location, title of collection, all that sort of stuff are the things generally that you'll find in these software packages. None of that should be, surprising to you. Here's what, this inventory looks like in archive space. You notice everything, air travel is a sub-series, and general air problems at Danbury Airport is a file. So this is what we were looking at in the public view of this finding, but it's all in archive space the same way, and archive space actually exports what we were looking at. Finally, so because these finding aids are in EAD, I can put this EAD finding aid in Connecticut's Archives Online, and this is what that collection looks like in CAO. It's the same data. I don't do anything more to it. I don't have to save it in 3 different places. I have one place, and it goes to all these different end user services because it's in EAD. It is a transportable format. So just to show you, and once you have that, you can share it with any number of places, and they can usually import it into a system or display it. And just for got a couple minutes here. So if I were doing an inventory and I'm not using software, basically the things that you want to have in an inventory, or you want to express your hierarchy or your arrangement. Here I have a correspondence series, but each row is assigned a what's a non-jargony term? Well, each row is a reference to a place in the inventory. In this case, we're saying this row is the correspondence series, and everything under it is in that series. And we're telling what box, what folder it is, and giving a date range, and then sometimes a note. And that's kind of, that's most of the time, that's how you're going to be describing items in an inventory or files in an inventory. Okay, so I will stop there and stop my share.
Great.
And run away.
Thanks, Brian. I think, let me start my video so you can see me here. So I think, one of the things that I'm getting a sense for what I've been seeing in the chat so far is a lot of the folks here are not right now in a position to be using some of the software that you've described. Mm-hmm. So, while I think many of them aspire to that at a future moment, where they are working from right now is probably, okay, they're thinking through arranging and describing their collections and things like that. So I think a lot of the questions that we've been getting so far have been a lot more about kind of like, okay, well, in the absence of like using archive space, maybe we're not in Connecticut collections, what are the sorts of things that we should be doing? Creating an inventory in a spreadsheet. Is that, I think you were getting to this at the very end, but there was a question about like, do you create the inventory in these programs? Do you have to do that? Can you work in a spreadsheet if you're working in a spreadsheet? And in my own experience, a lot of repositories I've been at have used a spreadsheet when they're processing the collection, going through and making that inventory. But it's just that the fields that they're using, that they've used to structure that spreadsheet are akin to those EAD fields, or the sorts of fields that DACS would recommend that you use, so that from there you can easily create a finding aid with that hierarchical structure. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so first, using, if you're starting off from square one and your archive has nothing, you don't have anything online about your collections, the best thing for you to do is do a repository level finding aid, which is a finding aid that describes generally what you have in all your collections. You can talk about the repository itself. You can talk about what subjects are featured in that repository, but it's just a placeholder for while you fill in what your constituent collections are. But that's the best thing to do. And if you want to do that, there's a application to participate in Connecticut's Archives Online. If you fill out that application, we will generate an EAD finding aid for your repository from that application. I mean, there's a few fields that you'll fill out, like, subjects that relate to your, but that's the best thing for you to start with. So if you have nothing, start from there. After that, in terms of adding individual collections or creating a finding aid for something, the best thing to do is, if I were starting out, I would opt to use tools that were offered to me. So one of the things is in Connecticut's Archives Online, you can apply to be part of the Connecticut's Archives Online, and you get an instance of archive space. You get your own repository. You can create finding aids in that using that interface. Now, if you need training in that, there's lots of training videos and things, but that's what I would do. Short of that, you should, like I said in the presentation, whatever you do in creating a word process finding aid, you should have your ultimate aim on the horizon being, at some point, this needs to be in this standard form. So I'm going to adhere to DACS. I'm going to adhere to fields that are used in EAD. All those are really easy to find. And if you need, guidance with it, there's millions of finding aids out there online. Just Linda mentioned this last week. Find a collection that's similar to the one that you're describing. There probably is something similar to it, and just copy that finding aid. Not literally, but I mean, copy how they did it, what fields they used, and things like that. And then you'll at least be sure that you're, doing it in a standard way, if not, the ultimately best way. Does that answer?
I think that's helpful, Brian. And there are a number of other questions here that I want to get to as well. I just need to, I've been trying to address some of them in the chat as we go. So let me just go back and find these questions. So,
well, and while you're looking, another thing too that you should take advantage of is, we talked about it before the session started, visit an archive. If any of you are local to Danbury or sort of nearby, you can just book an appointment and come by and look at how we do things. And, or any number of institutions that are doing kind of what you want to be doing, go visit them. And it's not a undue burden on that institution to give you a hand. It's not an undue burden for people to email me, I'm doing this, what should I do? What's the best thing? And there is a community out there, and they're a helpful bunch. So
so I think, there are a number of questions that were kind of related to these questions around like the inventory versus the finding aid. And I'm going to, because you've had a chance to talk a bit more about that, I'm going to set those aside for a minute, because I think we've probably addressed them all. If you had a question that Brian has not already addressed, please pop it in the chat again. I've been trying to kind of group these together. So we have a question about kind of like, sort of more a collection level question. So if you're working with a collection that's primarily printed books, published materials, I take that to be, which you're cataloging with cataloging software, but you also have a small collection of archival material that you'd like to make publicly accessible. How do your catalog and your finding aids interact? Are they two totally separate things altogether? Are there any systems that allow you to manage these things in the same place?
Well, there's a couple ways to deal with it. So the books in this example, if the books are already cataloged, and they're, already in the OPAC, that's fine. And then you have a group of archival materials. One of the things that you can do is you can create a finding aid for the archival materials, and then in a note, saying in a separated materials note, you can say this collection included these 150 books. You could list the titles. You can link out to the OPAC if that's necessary, or you may just need to put the titles. I mean, unless the person is really if this was George Washington, then you would probably want to be really fastidious about how you link out to your, keeping your link to the specific record in the catalog and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, you just, and this is very common that archival collections come in with a book collection. You don't need to inventory the book collection necessarily. You could, but you can just take a nod to it and say, search, the Abigail Thompson collection in our OPAC, and you will get all those titles.
Yeah, and I mean,
there are lots of ways to deal with it, but I mean, generally, what I've done is I just reference these books are in our rare book collection, and just list out the titles.
I think it's more like knowing Carol and the Godfrey. This is the Godfrey Library, which is primarily a genealogical research library here in Middletown. Their collection is mostly books. But I think she's just talking about, like, should her finding aids be related at all to the cataloging system that she's using for the books or not? I think customarily they're not, right? These are two separate things.
I mean, usually all our finding aids are in our OPAC.
Okay.
And that's one of the things that having EAD allows you to do, because you can convert your EAD finding aid into a MARC record and put it in your catalog. Now, do people come to our collections through the OPAC? No. I mean, maybe. Can
you just say what OPAC is? Can you expand that?
Online public access through the library's catalog. Yeah. But if you have your finding aid, you can put it in the catalog, and if people are searching, for doing research on a particular person, they will come across your finding aid. Now, there is the problem that it is somewhat confusing when you come to a finding aid in a book catalog, but having as many ways into what is in your archive it's all good. So, but having a finding aid in EAD allows you to put things easily into online public access catalogs.
Thanks, Brian. The Institute for American Indian Studies in Washington was asking about, and this is something we talked about briefly in one of the other sessions, around the best practices or suggestions for naming or creating those collection identifiers that you talked about. As I recall, this was something is basically like your repository decides what the practice is, just make it standardized. Is there anything that you would add to that?
That's correct. I mean, there are certain common practices for coming up with that identifier. You'll see MS, which is short for manuscript, which usually doesn't mean it's manuscript material. It's just a holdover from days gone by, but it is common. Like it was just something that I walked into here. Things were referred to as MS something. but you just want to have something that is meaningful to you. Some people will have different designations, so they might have manuscripts with MSO, MS and then a number for manuscript collections, or typescripts TS, or you can do things like that. But essentially, you just want to have a policy where you do use an identifier that is meaningful to you. So you don't want it to be too long or too complicated, but it's just a shorthand for referring to a collection.
Yeah, and this is something that if people were able to take a look at the document that you posted in the Google Classroom, you talk a little bit about this and why you put leading zeros on things for sorting and things like that. Let's see, let me go back and see. So there was a kind of a question that we have only kind of touched on. And this goes back to the question of using a spreadsheet to capture some of this information. iPad 171 asks, can you just use an Excel or Google spreadsheet and save it as a searchable PDF? And if so, are there any out there to use as a template? I take this to be more a question of how should you structure that spreadsheet? And you've talked a little bit about this in terms of EAD, but can you help iPad 171 a little bit with thinking through that process?
Yeah, so if that was your goal, your spreadsheet, like I had in my slides, I don't think on the Google Classroom page, the link is in there. And I don't know, you guys can circulate the link to the slides later, but essentially you want the box. You want columns that are related to the box, the folder, the title, the date begin, date end, and a note. Those would be optimally what you would have in that spreadsheet. Then if you want to export that spreadsheet as a PDF, fine. But just remember, and there's a term, in archives, like the document of record is that spreadsheet. So if you make changes to that spreadsheet, make changes to save that spreadsheet, make sure you're treating it. This is the inventory, and that PDF is my expression of that inventory. But what really is that inventory that we pay attention to for, in perpetuity is that spreadsheet. But that is a valid way of doing it. And if you have that structure and you want to go into EAD, you can contact a guy that looks like me at Westcon with the same name, and I can help you get that. It's really easy to get it into EAD and into a finding aid. So if you go to that trouble, people can help you. Enough said.
Great, Brian. And I'm wondering, given all of this, Gloria, the video of this session is going to be on our YouTube channel and also in the Google Classroom, as with all the videos for this series. So before I ask you to say a little bit more about how organizations who might be interested in working with Connecticut Archives Online can do that, because I think that is, is a free service that you're providing to help people create EAD compliant, like DACS compliant EAD finding aids, right? We have one more question from Jesse. Has anyone ever exported an Excel inventory spreadsheet into Past Perfect? Past Perfect seems to be an Access database. I think this is also a question for the group, but I don't know, Jesse, if you want to say more about that. Does Past Perfect do finding aids?
It used to. I don't think it does anymore.
Yeah.
And it's
Linda says no.
It's not very nice for, import, export kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Connecticut collections exist. I mean, it's a fine thing, but it is a black box. And so as archivists, you want not only your materials accessible, but you also want your data to be accessible and not locked in a box that you can't do anything with it. So one of the nice things about using software that will export EAD is you can take that EAD and go anywhere you want. It's your data, but you have it. it's in a form that other people can read, that you can read it too. It's just in code, but it's a human readable code. So
yeah, I think, Jesse, the answer to your question is that is not recommended. And Past Perfect is not really designed for archival use. And if you're interested in Connecticut collections, you can please reach out to us here at the League. We'd be happy to talk with you more if you want to come out of Past Perfect at all. But I think, Brian's point is really important here. And I think this goes back, this is kind of at the heart of Jesse's question, is that if you have those fields, even if they're in an Excel spreadsheet form, that is data that is usable, right? It could potentially be brought, maybe not into Past Perfect, but if those are EAD compliant fields, they could be sucked in to an archival system like Connecticut Collections or Archive Space with some data mapping. So it might be a little work, but that those fields would exist in that spreadsheet. Is that correct?
That is exactly right. And I mean, I implied it in the presentation that, if you're going to do the data, if you're going to record data, using a spreadsheet is a much better, vessel for that. It's down the road is going to give you a lot more options than if you just put things in a table in Microsoft Word.
Okay, great. So I want you to talk a little bit about Connecticut's Archives Online and how organizations that might be interested after this session, they want to create finding aids. Maybe they have a rough inventory. How do they work with you to, for free, make those accessible to the public as EAD finding aids through CAO?
So essentially, all you have to do is, if you go to if you Google Connecticut's Archives Online, you'll get the link to the site, and you click the participate button. It gives you an application to participate. You fill that out, and you tell us whether you got EAD. You tell us whether you want a collection level, a repository level finding aid, all those sort of things, and we will get you started. And the nice thing that it provides you is, we want to have researchers be able to find whatever is in Connecticut archives in one place. So if our goal is to provide that service to researchers, all you have to do is provide the data. So once you set up an account with us, we can set you up with an instance of Archive Space, and you can add collections. I think there's 30 repositories using our instance of Archive Space, and so you can play around with it and learn about it by just playing around with it. You're not committed to go public with what you're doing, but you're in a situation where you can reach out to other repositories. You can reach out to us, and we'll help you if you have problems with your description or whatever. But the end result is you're listed as a repository among the other repositories in Connecticut. When people search collections in Connecticut, they will search your stuff along with Yale and UConn and even the illustrious Western Connecticut State University. All those places, you will be putting your material together with that. And you can point to those pages where you're displaying the finding aid, and you don't have to do anything with your EAD. You've got you'll have a site that shows your logo and your finding aid right there. So it's pretty good. And I mean, it's like I'm not just the hair care club president. I'm saying this seriously, that if I were in your shoes, I would definitely take advantage of it, because it gives you the profile to be among the other repositories in Connecticut, but it also provides you with an easy entree into having your stuff on the web. So that being said, you can't go wrong. So it's there and it's pretty easy to participate. And there's a contact us link there on the site if you have any problems with it, or need me to sell it more, or need me to sell hair care products. Anything, I'll do it.
Thanks, Brian. Carol has one last question before we go. How does Connecticut Archives Online relate to or compare with Archive Grid?
It's a subset of Archive Grid.
So information in Connecticut and CAO feeds to Archive Grid, which is a national database for national database.
Archive Grid, you have to pay to play. So a lot of the collections that are listed in CAO are redundantly listed in Archive Grid. Archive Grid is going away. I'm on a committee that's looking at the National Finding Aids Network, which is going to replace Archive Grid. It's sort of up in the air how that model is going to work. But the bug you should have in your ear is not whether you're listed in CAO or Archive Grid, but having your data in EAD is going to facilitate your participation in any of those aggregators. That, is the way to go. So whatever you do, if you want to have your things listed somewhere, have that EAD creation in the back of your head.
Great. I'm gonna, I think, Brian, is the Confluence page for NAFAN the link that I should put if people are interested in learning more about that project, or is it the OCLC page?
Either one, though I haven't looked to see how up to date they are, but I mean, okay. Essentially it's going to replace Archive Grid, and the intent is to have some of the functionality that CAO has in like EAD creation or collection creation. But it's still in the works, so it's not totally there yet. But when it is there, we are definitely on the same page with them. So we would be working seamlessly with NAFAN.
Great. And I think, for those of you, even if you aren't familiar with these national networks like Archive Grid or the one that's being built right now, you can think about this if you're familiar with something like the DPLA, the Digital Public Library of America, which you may have used to search for, digitized images. The DPLA has like a state hub in every state. Ours here in Connecticut is the Connecticut Digital Archive at UConn. So anything that's pushed to CTDA gets pushed also and is discoverable through DPLA. And the process that Brian is describing here is basically a parallel one for finding aids, because the DPLA, CTDA, they don't work with finding aids. They're not really structured in that way. But this is, for someone like myself, NAFAN sounds amazing. I can imagine being in graduate school and being able to search something like that. It has not existed. And I think, one of the things that I would say, just to help us wrap up a little bit here, I would definitely echo Brian's suggestion to, go to a repository. If you haven't been to an archival repository, CHS, the state library, UConn, WestConn, Litchfield Historical Society, I think, has some pretty good processes in place, right, Linda? There are a number of places around, large and small around the state of Connecticut that have, great archives, great research rooms, that, if you're interested in understanding how this works from the researcher's perspective, if you haven't used a finding aid to find something that you're looking for before, it really helps you understand why they're important and why they're structured the way that they are, and why you don't have to describe every single little thing in your archive. The other thing that I would say is look at finding aids. Brian has mentioned this and has provided in his homework a lot of information about, like, links to take a look at this finding aid. And, Leith and Linda were doing this last time as well. So if you haven't become familiar with kind of like how finding aids look and looked at a bunch of them, you will feel a lot calmer and more in control, I think, of things if you just spend some time looking at other people's finding aids. They really are very standard. That's the idea. And to help you make you feel a little better, a lot of places have them in Word documents. A lot of places just have them on paper. Like, it's not ideal. We're trying to move toward the world that Brian was describing at the beginning and the end of his talk, but we're not there yet. And it's okay if you are not there yet. Even large repositories are working. I mean, you can't search all the finding aids of the National Archives online. Have you ever tried to do that? It gets better every year, but I mean, like, even our national archives are not at this place. Yeah, I mean, and Linda's saying even look at Yale. So, I think that this is aspirational and it's okay to feel like you're not there yet, but describe what you can and make what you can accessible to researchers so they can know the gems that you have at your institution. That's really kind of like the point of this entire series, is to help
And
you
the other
understand
thing,
the best practices for doing that. Go ahead, Brian.
and the other thing too, to add to that is, like I said earlier, you don't have to have the perfect finding aid the first go around. You are trying to get that wrestled into control. And so you may have, a finding aid that you are, this gets you there kind of, and then we're working on it, and you can iteratively work on something as you go along, and that's really common. And it's not a situation where it gets published on the web and now you're stuck with it. It's an active document, and it should be. So you can do it wrong and somebody point out, but here, maybe you should do this, and then you can do it. You can change things up. So
Great. Well, I want to thank you all. I know we went over a little bit, but I did want to offer a little bit of handholding because I was just sensing a little bit of sort of like feeling a little overwhelmed by a lot of this stuff in the beginning. So I just wanted to make sure everyone knows, like, you don't have to be on top of all of this stuff. We're trying to provide for you a structure of like the most aspirational thing that you can do. So I want to give Brian a huge thanks. And I do want to put in an extra plug for Connecticut's Archives Online. It's a great service out of Wisconsin. So if you're interested in getting help to, make finding aids in the way that Brian has just described, apply to participate, and Brian can help you out. Next week, I hope you will join us for preservation, storage, and housing of archival collections, guidelines and solutions with Tara Kennedy, who's a preservation services librarian at Yale. Thanks once again to the NHPRC for the funding for this webinar series, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you so much for being here.